This is Joseph Carpenter. Today is the 28th of November, 2023, and I'm interviewing Dr. John Garrigus. This interview is taking place at University Hall on the campus of the University of Texas at Arlington. This interview is sponsored by the UTA History Department and the College of Liberal Arts and is part of the UTA Author Insight Collection. Dr. Garrigus is a professor of history at the University of Texas at Arlington. He is the author of several books, including his most recent work, A Secret Among the Blacks, Slave Resistance Before the Haitian Revolution. This was published in 2023 by Harvard University Press. So before we go into the book, I want to ask you a few questions about yourself.
Yeah.
Where are you from originally, and tell me a little bit about your growing up.
I grew up in the Midwest in Indiana, so there's just small towns. My dad was a pastor in those towns. So, grew up kind of in the American heartland, I suppose you could say. And even went to university at DePaul University, which is another, I think, a really good school, but it's also in a small town like the ones I grew up in.
And how did you decide on history as your chosen field?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I actually really enjoyed English classes more than I had great history professors, but really enjoyed tearing apart stories. But history just always seemed to be really important to me. I just felt like there were a lot of things I didn't really understand. Who was Napoleon? What was World War II? Alexander the Great. These kind of questions that I just thought that was important information to know. So that was an age when you couldn't just turn to your phone and get those answers right away.
Right. And so you had initially thought about English?
Yeah, I thought it maybe English or maybe French. I was a French minor in college, but history would really seem like a very interesting and important thing to study.
Did anyone in particular influence your decision to go into history as a profession?
Well, I had some great professors at DePaul, and the very first semester I was in like an intro to Western Civ, and my professor pulled me aside and said, "Wow, you really seem like you're really enjoying this a lot." And he got me interested in doing a off-campus semester. So I went to the Newberry Library in Chicago in my junior year, and that was a fantastic experience for a kid from a small town to live in Chicago and work at a big research library. Ended up writing a paper about the French Revolution based on primary sources that, at that time you couldn't get those kind of revolutionary pamphlets. So that was a really exciting thing for me, and that kind of smoothed my entry into graduate school and then the profession.
What time frame are we talking about here?
This would have been in the mid-1980s. Actually, no, I take it back, in the late 70s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where is DePaul located?
It's in Greencastle, Indiana, which is about an hour and a half west of Indianapolis.
Okay. And did you have any, besides this one professor that you mentioned, did you have any other mentors?
Yeah, well, actually, everybody in that department really rallied around me. And so I had that professor who kind of picked me out early. I had another professor who taught French history who knew that was my interest. And he and I did a number of independent studies where we would just meet in his office and I would read books. And it was really good preparation for graduate school. But also just the enthusiasm of the department about my interests was really gratifying and important to me. Because no one in my family had ever, gone beyond, much beyond like a BA in liberal arts subject. So,
how did you wind up at UTA?
Well, I did a PhD in French colonial history, I guess you would call it, at Johns Hopkins, and it was in the late 1980s. Jobs were really hard to find, and I got a job in a small school in North Florida, in Jacksonville, Florida, and it was a terrific place. I taught there for 20 years. I wrote a dissertation about this French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is today Haiti, but I had a really hard time selling that book to academic publishers. It was really a study of how the French defined racial categories, how they defined who was white and who was non-white in the free population, which had as many free Black and biracial people as white colonists. And those lines of racial definition were shifting in the course of the 18th century. So I thought that was a really interesting topic. It is a really interesting topic, But in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I could not find anyone interested in publishing that book. It didn't have Toussaint Louverture in it. It wasn't about the revolution. And so for 20 years, I worked on that book. And then finally in 2006, it was almost 20 years after defending the dissertation, I got it published. And I had another publication too, a collection of primary sources with my friend Laurent Dubois. And that kind of brought me to UTA's attention. So I applied for a job here as a colonial Latin Americanist. Right. Haiti in many ways is the first Latin American country, even though of course it's not a Spanish-speaking or Portuguese-speaking country. It was the first independent country in the Americas where the majority of the population was not from Europe. And so in many ways, and I study colonial Latin American history, so I came here to teach that subject. And then I've been able to kind of expand now that I've been here on the faculty.
Why that subject?
Why colonial Latin America?
Yes.
Well, in part because I understood that people are having a hard time understanding the significance of Haiti. Okay. In the 1980s and 1990s, people sort of, even when I was growing up in high school, for example, reading high school books, the Haitian Revolution was often described as a tragedy. It was seen as like, a slave rebellion destroyed France's most profitable colony. And of course, today we see the Haitian Revolution as an incredible, step forward for human liberation. It was the only time in world history where enslaved people have risen up and successfully defeated their oppressors and established a new nation. So today we see it as kind of the core revolution in what we call the Age of Atlantic Revolutions, which includes the American Revolution and the French Revolution and different Latin American wars for independence. But in the 1990s, people didn't really understand that. Right. So I understood I need to find a way of explaining to people what I'm working on and situate it in that Latin American context. So that's what, as a teacher, that's how I kind of sold myself.
I see.
And I also, came to realize, a lot of people have come to realize, that though the French Revolution was a very important event in world history, in many ways the Haitian Revolution, which came out of those events, surpassed it in lasting change for the Americas, and again, in terms of the liberation of enslaved people. So the French Revolution in the last maybe 10 years, scholars of that revolution have come to see the Haitian Revolution as something they have to teach about. They have to explain how the French were brought to end slavery by their colonial people. And even though the French went back and reinstalled slavery under Napoleon, in the Caribbean, people remained free in the country that became Haiti.
How did the French end up with a colony in the Caribbean when most of it was Spanish?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. This island of Hispaniola is an island today. It's got one island, two countries, Haiti on the western side and Dominican Republic on the eastern side. That's where Columbus first landed. It's a very unusual island geographically. It's got a big mountain range, very mountainous, particularly on the western part. Very hard to control the way you could militarily control more of an oval-shaped island like Cuba or Puerto Rico or even Jamaica, which was a Spanish colony too. So when the Spanish moved on to the mainland, began to exploit the mines of Mexico and later Peru, they more or less withdrew from the Caribbean, and they found of all their Caribbean islands that Hispaniola's western coast was the most difficult to keep the foreigners out. The Dutch pirates, the English pirates, the French pirates, who wanted to come and trade for Spanish gold. So the Spanish withdrew their colonists from that part of the island. French and English and Dutch sailors established themselves there. They became what we call the buccaneers. And those buccaneers established a series of settlements on that part of the colony. And then France moved in and claimed their allegiance. And that way became really one of the major colonial powers in the Caribbean, even though, as you say, we don't really think of that today, thanks to the Haitian Revolution.
So what is your interest in the Haitian Revolution per se?
Well, my interest has always been to understand the roots of the revolution. So there's been a lot of amazing scholarship about the revolution itself, about Toussaint Louverture and his rise to power as this, man of African ancestry who becomes an extraordinary figure in diplomacy and military affairs, etc. So there's been a lot written about that, but we have for a long time not really understood what the enslaved people who made up the masses of the revolution, what they were really aiming for. French colonists, of course, had every interest in portraying them as kind of bloodthirsty savages. And also as people who, before they were, quote unquote, riled up into revolution, French colonists claimed that these enslaved people had been pretty content under slavery, and that Napoleon should help them, reinstall slavery, and they could go back to the old ways, which were just fine. And in the last 20 years or so, we've come to understand that that was not true, but no one's ever really told the story of the enslaved people who came together on the night of August 22nd, 1791, and launched this incredible event. And I, for a long time, like most of my colleagues, assumed that the lives of those people were just not going to be accessible to us. Many of them died in the early revolution. Of course, they were not part of the French colonial regime. They didn't get to make documents, and if they were involved in documents, those were often destroyed. And so we had kind of written that off as a set of stories that we could only guess at. And what I've been able to do in this book is actually tell the stories of a dozen people. And those are stories that start 30 and 40 years before the revolution, and I trace them right up to the events of August 22nd.
This book is covers events before the revolution.
Right.
So did you feel like that the revolution had been covered maybe enough, and that you needed some insight as to what led up to the revolution? Was that the goal of this?
Yeah, I mean, people are interested in like, well, what caused the Haitian Revolution? You read the book on the Haitian Revolution, in the first chapter sort of talks about the slave regime and sort of lays out like what that author thinks was happening. And I read that, and there's a lot of stuff that didn't make sense to me in those early chapters, because of course the authors were moving on to tell the 10-year story of the revolution itself. Sure. And so one of the stories that didn't make sense was the idea that enslaved people were passive, that they accepted their enslavement until the revolution happened. That didn't make sense. The one exception to that story of passivity was the story of a man named Makandal, who's one of Haiti's great heroes. And Makandal is seen as the one resistance hero of the enslaved population. In the 1750s, he was accused, tried, and unjustly executed for what was seen as a great poison conspiracy. But when I began to look at the records and even the published accounts of the Makandal conspiracy, it emerged that the majority of the people who died from his quote-unquote poisons, most of those people were enslaved people. 90% of Makandal's victims were other enslaved people, even though colonists claimed he was trying to drive them out of the colony using African poisons. So I thought, that does not make sense. What is happening here? So I started to go and look carefully at those documents and recreate Makandal's world. And as I began to kind of pull on the threads, I began to discover a whole, I'd love to say a whole world, but it's not a whole world. It's just about a dozen stories that were preserved in the document because they were connected to this quote, infamous character, infamous to the colonists of Makandal. So their stories were preserved. And then I was able to figure out what was killing the people whose deaths were blamed on Makandal, and began to reconceptualize what Makandal and other people were doing in the middle of all those deaths.
And what conclusion did you come to?
Well, my conclusion is really kind of a reinterpretation of the causes of the Haitian Revolution, which would be sort of added to the existing literature. That I found that enslaved people in the northern part of Saint-Domingue, where the revolution broke out, were in the grips of a terrible environmental crisis that was caused by the French, both deliberately and accidentally. Deliberately in the sense that the French transformed the environment. They cut down the trees, they planted very profitable crops in sugar and then later coffee, and they brought in hundreds of thousands of people from Africa and enslaved them to work on those plantations. So that was something that was deliberate, the transformation of the environment. Second thing that they did that was also deliberate was they deliberately did not grow food. They wanted to focus on the things that they did best in the colony, which was grow sugar. And for years and years and years, they insisted on buying food from overseas. So they brought food from France, and they smuggled in food from neighboring colonies. And when France was at war with Britain, as they often were in the 1700s, those external sources of food dried up.
Oh.
And so this is another environmental crisis that enslaved people were caught in, that the French deliberately created, in the sense that they wanted to focus on growing sugar and not food. The third environmental crisis was the mysterious killer, which was actually a bacterial disease that was introduced into the colony by the French. Actually, this was accidental. And it killed livestock, and it killed thousands and thousands of people rapidly and mysteriously until really the 1770s and the 1780s, when French doctors and veterinarians began to realize, oh my gosh, this same disease we have in France, which today we call anthrax, had been introduced into Saint-Domingue and was going crazy, particularly in this northern region. So that was the mysterious killer of the 1750s. Its identity was uncovered in the 1780s by colonists, but the idea that enslaved people were trying to poison the whites was an idea that had become established in colonial culture, and colonists could not get beyond that idea. So they continued to torture and execute people for being poisoners, even though doctors and veterinarians all around them were saying, it's not a poison from Africa, it's a bacterial disease like the one we have in France.
Talk to me about the word poison, though. You learned something in the interpretation of that, is that correct?
Right, this is kind of one of the areas where historians have to kind of go beyond the documents, because the documents, in the documents, there's a man named Medor, the very first person arrested as a poisoner, and he talks freely about his use of poison, which in French would be poison, it's the same word. But as it turns out, in the 18th century, the word poison or poison was undergoing a redefinition in France, and had always meant a variety of things in Africa. And of course, Medor was a native African person speaking French as a second language. So in France even, poison had always been associated with kind of mysterious substances. Today, of course, we think of poison as chemical. But in the 1600s, and even in the 1700s, French doctors and priests and others saw poison as something that could also be a spiritually powerful substance. For example, if you took a piece of communion wafer and did some, I don't know, ceremony with it that was outside the church, and then gave it to somebody, and they got sick, you were said to have poisoned them spiritually. And in many African societies, the word poison could mean a dangerous substance, but it could also, again, mean a spiritual substance, something that was powerful in ways that we would not understand as being, as being kind of chemically harmful. So what I had to do in reinterpreting these interrogations was, when people like Medor said the word poison, I had to think, is he really mean poison, or does he mean medicine?
Right.
And because so many of Medor's quote-unquote victims were other enslaved people and animals, whose death he clearly regretted, I came to the conclusion that Medor and others who confessed to poisoning were really trying to use African-style medicines to help their fellow enslaved people.
And up to that time, had anthrax been known and understood as a killer bacteria?
No. I mean, of course, the bacterial roots of it only came out later in the 1800s. But, anthrax is a tricky disease because you can get it on your skin where it makes dark pustules. But a lot of people had different skin diseases in the 18th century, right? People had terrible boils and all sorts of things. So they began to realize that some boils or pustules were malignant. In fact, in English, anthrax was called the malignant pustule because people didn't really understand it. It was different from other pustules. Then the other thing is, when an animal who has these malignant pustules dies, it might be totally healthy. Many hungry people or unscrupulous butcher would think that animal's meat is still good, and they would serve the meat or maybe take the leather and then transmit the disease to other people's skin, and then they would have the pustules.
Right.
But more mysteriously, when people ate the meat, they would get those pustules inside their digestive system.
Really?
And it would kill them in 24 hours.
Wow.
And the causes would be mostly invisible.
Right.
They wouldn't have these telltale blotches on their skin. And so that's what was happening in Saint-Domingue. People were starving because of environmental crisis. They turned to animals that they thought were healthy that had died suddenly. They ate the meat of those animals, undercooked, and then they died terrible deaths. In the 1770s and 1780s, doctors began to dissect those people, perform autopsies on animals and also people. And then they saw the evidence. So it's pretty clear to me that this was happening in the 1750s. Colonists found out about it in the 1770s and 1780s. But by then, the idea of Mackandal, the poisoner, he had been killed, but colonists believed he had transmitted his ideas. That idea of the poisoner was very alive and very well. And enslaved people were suffering terrible, both anthrax attacks and then attacks from their enslavers who blamed them for the deaths.
Right. Let me step back for a minute. It may be stepping back, but culturally speaking, what role did the Catholic Church play in Haiti in particular?
Yeah. Of course, the French claimed that they were doing God's work in enslaving African people and bringing them to work in the colonies because they were converting them to Catholicism along the way. In practice, Saint-Domingue was such a society driven by profit that most colonists were not very interested in religion. Yet there were priests, and in the northern part of the colony, the Jesuit priests in particular were very enthusiastic about their religious mission. So they were the people who had the closest contact with enslaved people. They were working to convert them, and they heard their confessions, etc. And so when this charge of poisoning spread, and colonists began burning people at the stake, like dozens and dozens of people, a few Jesuit priests stepped forward and advised some of the black prisoners, the so-called poisoners, not to tell stories and not to talk about poison and not to blame, not to inculpate or tell stories about other people who were using quote-unquote poison.
I see.
When the colonists found out that the Jesuits were giving this advice, they concluded that the Jesuits were also involved in the poisoning scare. And so in Saint-Domingue, the Jesuit order was expelled because of their involvement in the Mackandal poisoning story. In fact, some of the earliest documents we have about the poisoning affair in Saint-Domingue were printed in France as a way of attacking the Jesuit order, which was unpopular in France at that time, and was eventually expelled from France as well. So the Jesuits were probably the one group of Europeans at that time who might have understood that the word poison meant many different things.
I see.
But colonists were not interested in that. Remember, this is a society where enslaved people outnumber their enslavers 9 to 1.
Wow.
So 90% of the people are enslaved. So the 10% of the enslavers are feeling, very nervous about the situation.
Sure.
Yet it's quite profitable for them.
What role did the French Revolution play in the run-up to the Haitian Revolution?
Yeah, the French Revolution, of course, was really a moment when a financial crisis drove France to create a new constitution, to reform their tax system, and that meant really reforming their entire society. In essence, the French Revolution brought the French to redefine who is French? And the idea that all residents of the kingdom, whether they were nobles, clergy, or commoners, were all equal, was a profound redefinition of the idea of Frenchness.
I see.
And so out of that comes these ideas of like all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson was in Paris during the early French Revolution. He helped write the Declaration of the Rights of Man using that same language that he put in the American Declaration of Independence. And yet in a slave colony like Saint-Domingue, the idea that all men were created equal was an incredibly dangerous idea, dangerous to slavery.
Sure.
And so those revolutionary ideas were seized upon by different people in the colony, including wealthy biracial men, This is the group I studied in my first book.
Oh, okay.
Many of them were educated in France. Some of them owned hundreds of people. They were enslavers as well. And yet, because they were biracial, their ancestry was mixed African and European, they were considered lower in the racial hierarchy. So they saw the French Revolution as a chance for them to get equality, which is exactly what the revolution promised. And when they went to France, people in France saw, well, yeah, you're a wealthy French person. You're just from the colonies, your skin's a little bit darker, but yeah, of course you're going to be equal. But then when they went back to the colonists refused to accept that. And so conflict between these quote white French people and these, let's say, brown French people destabilized the colony and helped give enslaved black people sort of a moment when they could sort of seize the opportunity to rise up. And now we know, thanks to the book, that they had formed a series of communities, not one single revolutionary community, but different kinds of communities to fight against the anthrax threat. And those communities were the ones that allowed leaders to mobilize people to very quickly pull thousands of enslaved people into a terribly dangerous revolution that ultimately succeeded.
Because of anthrax.
Right. And so what I show in the book in a series of maps is how the anthrax threat was all around the Noé plantation and the Clément or Duty plantation where the revolution broke out. So Boukman Duty, one of the famous leaders that we know about from the Haitian Revolution, the man who lit the spark, he was living in a zone where people all around him for decades had been infected with a terrible anthrax disease and then have been tortured and killed for causing that disease. Boukman Duty lived 30 years after Mackandal and never knew Mackandal, but he lived like 3 miles from where Mackandal had his own community using African, not medicines, but using African spiritual objects to help people against the mysterious killer. So I kind of show a link in the book between the Mackandal event and the Boukman's Haitian Revolution, using maps and using geography to show that Mackandal was not a poisoner, but he was a person who created kind of communities, the kind that Boukman and other revolutionary leaders 30 years later could mobilize. And that's the sort of x-ray of the enslaved population that kind of we've never really had before. The ability to see past the famous leader into the men and women who really made the revolution happen.
You focus on a dozen people in this book. Why did you choose to go about it that way, first of all, and what did you find when you focused on these people?
Yeah, for one thing, I wanted to write a book that my friends, my students, my family members, my neighbors could enjoy reading. And my other books, honestly, I mean, I'm proud of them, but they're basically written for other professors and graduate students. So Secret Among the Blacks is really a book that my friends and my students, my undergraduates as well as graduate students can read. And for that, I had to have people. I had to have characters. So that was important. Then as historians, we're kind of trapped by the documents that we interpret, in the sense that we're so interested in the documents. Like, who wrote that? Who wrote this? What was going on in that person's life? What did he or she hope to do with this, with this document? And a lot of times when we write up our answers to those questions, we're writing about the author of the document, except that would be the person who tortured Mackandal. That would be the person who interrogated Medor and had him, wanted to have him put to death. Those would be the people who weren't the heroes of the revolution, but were actually the colonists who were trying to prevent the revolution.
I see.
So it was really difficult, honestly, because I always wanted to talk about these colonists whose stories have been told again and again and again. But I worked at it, and I eventually kind of flipped the story. So that the book is really a story about individual men and women and their courage and the misunderstandings in which they were trapped. It's about a man named Medor, a woman named Assam, of course a man named Mackandal, a woman named Kingay, a woman named Lisette, These were people whose stories had never been told, or if they've been told, they've always been told with the understanding that they were somehow using poison to kill people. And instead, I'm able to show a very different set of events and motivations for them.
Why was it important for you to change your audience, if you will, for this particular book?
You know, I don't know. I mean, you know, I'm a full professor at UTA thanks to my last book. So this was a book that I wrote just out of my own interest in the Haitian Revolution and my feeling, gosh, I'd like to have a book that I could really give to students that would really help them understand this terrible place and how that finally came to an end. So in many ways, it was really driven by the frustration that the books that I respected and admired that were about the pre-revolutionary period were just not very accessible to people. And we do have some really good books about the revolution itself that are quite accessible to people. But those books oftentimes don't really tell us the stories of the ordinary people before the revolution.
What do you hope the larger takeaway is when someone reads this book? What do you want them to understand?
Well, I guess I want them to understand the courage of the people who made the revolution happen. For people who aren't necessarily interested in Haiti, but interested in the larger story of slavery and resistance throughout the Americas, I want them to understand that the communities that people formed in Haiti, but also in Mexico and in the United States and in Jamaica and Brazil, the communities that people formed were not just there for their relaxation or their entertainment, but forming communities was essential to giving people the chance to imagine a future. And so there's a big debate among scholars and even among popular people, like, why did the United States, for example, not have more slave resistance, even though there were, of course, some amazing uprisings in the United States, but sort of have that idea, just like as with Saint-Domingue, that enslaved people kind of accepted slavery. And I think that's not true. And I think one of the things the book shows is that the formation of these groups of people who were trusted each other with their lives because they were involved in religious activity, in legal activity, in maybe resistance against the master in the household, that those communities were resistance. Sometimes they resulted in violent uprisings, as in Saint-Domingue, and other societies they didn't. But just to come together and form those kind of bonds was in itself a radical act of resistance.
And you mentioned students, for instance, finding this book accessible. Who else? Who else would you like to see this book reach?
Well, I'd like to see it reach ordinary people who are interested in history. When I say ordinary, I mean people who aren't professional historians or academics. Because I do think people understand that in the last 20 years, we've kind of gone through a sea change in our understanding of race and slavery in the United States. It remains controversial, of course. It's changes in our historical understanding are, it's like different from what we were taught in high school, what we were taught at an earlier age. And so that's been hard for people to understand. But I think we've come to understand that the Haitian Revolution was an amazing event in world history, and that it had profound impact on the United States, made the Louisiana, as part of the events that made the Louisiana Purchase possible, for example. It created all kinds of fears and hopes among people in the United States, depending which side of the slavery situation they were on. And yet we haven't really been able to understand it. So on a human scale, oftentimes slave revolutions or any kind of revolution is told in massive, the masses of people, and it's hard to really focus on the individual men and women. So that's what I think this book, I hope people will find a book does successfully, is that it shows them the stories of individual men and women that they can somehow hold on to. I just went to see, I'm teaching the French Revolution and Napoleon right now here at UTA. And yesterday I went to see the Napoleon movie, 2.5-hour movie, and just marveled at the director's need to kind of collapse the massive story of Napoleon's career into his relationship with Josephine, and then a few key battles. Because, you know, there's so much that happens in these revolutionary periods that the scale is vast in terms of the ideas and the action. And yet, as human beings, we want to come back to the story of a man, the story of a woman, things that we can identify with. Of course, as a historian, a professional historian, you see a movie like that and you think, oh my gosh, that's such an oversimplification.
Right.
And yet, that kind of is what we connect with. And so as teachers, as writers of history, we need to find the stories that people will connect with. And of course, as academics, we want to tell it in a way that's supported by the archive.
Right.
And yet fun.
Yeah.
And so that's the challenge. And people who make films oftentimes have to tweak the archive a little bit, which of course is what Ridley Scott had to do for his movie. Kind of had Josephine die a little bit later than she actually did in history, so he could make her one of Napoleon's motivations for coming back to power in 1814 and 15.
That's interesting. You mentioned this is something that I was not aware of, and that is the role that the Haitian Revolution played in the Louisiana Purchase. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, Napoleon tried to restore slavery in the Caribbean, and even though he promised the people of Saint-Domingue he would not do it, it was quite clear that that was what he was up to. So he sent a massive expedition in 1802, and already by 1803, it was obvious that expedition was going very, very badly. Over 40,000 men would die. It was one of Napoleon's biggest expeditionary defeats. And so right in the middle of the news coming back from Saint-Domingue, Jefferson sends his envoys with the idea, of course, of just buying the port of New Orleans, and Napoleon's willing to make a deal. The entire Louisiana territory. Because Napoleon had hoped to retake his Caribbean territories and to use Louisiana territory as a possible springboard for perhaps a conquest of the Spanish Empire in Latin America.
I see.
So the Haitian revolutionaries, when they defeated Napoleon's troops, made that impossible and made Napoleon realize he needed to stop focusing on the Americas and turn his attention to having himself declared emperor and moving on into Central Europe. So it's the timeline is not exact, right? The defeat of Napoleon's troops, their expulsion and Haitian independence comes about a year after the Louisiana Purchase. But it's very clear that the French understood that their plans for Louisiana were being spoiled by the Haitian resistance.
And excuse me, you mentioned people like to have characters or like to have their history simplified. The people that you present in the book are not simple people,
right?
However, how did you go about bringing them to life? What was the process to bring those people to life in the book, so that people would understand who they are and the importance of their existence?
Yeah, I mean, I had to do all that documentary work that we always do. Who wrote this document? What were they trying to accomplish with it? Then I had to kind of flip the story just to think, well, this man named Medor is saying he poisoned animals and people, but then he's also angry at the men who gave him these poisons. So why did he give them poisons if he was angry at the men who made the poisons that ended up killing his patients? And so I had to rethink, okay, maybe by poison he means medicine. Maybe he's angry that the poison turned out to actually be poisonous in our modern sense of the word. So once I was able to do that, then I began to also pay attention to other things that, for example, Medor was saying. Medor's the one who gave us this idea, it's in the title of the book, A Secret Among the Blacks. Medor was talking about giving medicines to his enslaver, and he had been doing this for some 20 years. Of course, he called them poisons, but the enslaver was still alive. So I thought, either he's a really bad poisoner, or he means something else. I began to realize that Medor didn't want to kill his master.
Right.
He wanted to, I'll use quotation marks, heal him, because the master had promised to free Medor.
Oh, interesting.
And enslaved people understood that if a master had promised to free you, killing him was not a good idea, even if he had written that into his will.
Right.
Because as soon as he dies, your relationship with him, whatever it was, good or bad, is gone. Somebody else moves in, an attorney, an heir, an executor. And to that person, you're just a capital asset.
Right.
You're like a shed or a cow or a piece of land. And getting a manumission is a complicated process. It involved paying taxes, it involved writing letters to the governor. I began to realize, and historians have not really paid much attention to this, that the enslaved person's point of view on the manumission is they actually they need a love potion. That's what they need.
Right.
They need to make their master, no matter how much they hate him or her, they need to make that person motivated by some deep emotion to help them to see their humanity, essentially.
Sure.
So in a way, that's what I tried to do, is to see the humanity of Medor and to understand him not as a murderer or as an inherently violent person. So when Medor talks about a secret, he was actually talking about a group of people who were making these, once I understood that these were medicines, they were making these medicines in order to increase the population of free blacks. And he said in order to confront the whites, if necessary. And he said this will eventually lead to the end of the colony. So for colonists, this was crystal clear. It was a murder plot designed to drive them, to kill them all in their beds and to drive them out into the sea. But when I began to understand that poison was really medicine, and that it was really kind of a love potion, maybe to weaken the selfishness of your master so he would do this for you, I began to understand that the secret was really a long-term political project, that Medor and other people were thinking. They weren't trying to destroy the colony with violence and blood, though they were willing to threaten that because they knew they had to negotiate. They wanted to create a population of free black people that could eventually somehow pressure the whites to do something. What is it? We don't know, but I imagine that they understood this is going to take not days or weeks or months. This is going to take years. And it was going to be a slow process of negotiation. So in essence, what we have here is a political plan from a group of enslaved African people that colonists were always, keen to portray as bloodthirsty savages. So it's a whole side of enslaved people as political thinkers, as long-term thinkers, as people trying to shape society to lessen their suffering. And we don't know, did they want to do away with slavery or not? We don't know. But of course, people in Africa had forms of slavery and bondage. They were very different and much more person to person than the situation in the French colony. And also in the French colony, the idea of racial categories was layered over, so that a person who got free from slavery in the Americas would always be a person of African descent and could never really get away from that identity. Right. So, one imagines that Medor might have thought, maybe we'll have a society more like Africa, where a person might be enslaved, but they could get free. And then once they're free, they could gradually move up in society and eventually, be somehow equal to their master over time. That was impossible, of course, in the French Caribbean, but I'm just imagining what Medor might have imagined, because that's a vision of enslaved people that colonists were always trying to repress. The story of the revolution itself is full of black generals trying to negotiate with the whites. And every single time the colonists refuse to negotiate. They want to hold the line, absolutely. And this is why even, almost a century after, 75 years after Medor, Napoleon, he's got an amazing black general. He has an amazing black army in the Caribbean that would have made him the master of the whole region. And yet he's determined to bring back the colonial system and to put those people back in chains.
I see.
So negotiation was just not possible for the French.
Let me ask you a broader author question, kind of to close this out if we can. And that is, do you go into your research looking for that aha moment of for instance, you mentioned, the word poison and discovering that it was illogical for the enslaved to try to poison the white population under those circumstances, or poison each other for that matter.
Sure.
Do you go into your research looking for that thing that you can kind of hang your hat on, if you will? And if so, how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing I tell my students when we work with primary sources in the classroom is there something in this document that's missing, inconsistent, doesn't make sense to you, and can't be explained by the context or, so things that don't make sense are really the thing I think we need to look for. So the thing that drove me to write this book was the idea that Mackandal had killed 7,000 black people and maybe a couple hundred white people and 10, 20,000 cattle.
Yeah.
That just didn't make sense to me.
Right.
And so I began to pull the threads, and then eventually turned out, once I began to put this on a map, that all these people, all these cases of anthrax and resistance that people were associated with poisoning, it was all happening within just a few miles of where the Haitian Revolution broke out. So I didn't go into it thinking, I'm going to reinterpret the Haitian Revolution.
Right.
In fact, it was only when I got a contract with this press and my editor at Harvard said, this is a really interesting story of Mackandal, et cetera, but can you connect it to the Haitian Revolution? Then I began looking at my maps, and then I found Boukman living right here 3 miles from Mackandal, and then it all, like, wow. But it all started with kind of, unraveling that thread, which required taking 200 years of books about Mackandal that mentioned him, novels about Mackandal, a tradition, and being willing to kind of go against that once I found the evidence. So finding the inconsistency and then understanding how much of the history that we get from our teachers and our parents and our libraries has got an element of myth in it, or misunderstanding that it's up to us to reinterpret. So for 2 centuries, Mackandal was seen as a villain, a madman, and then in the early 20th century, he began to be seen as a hero. And he's been seen as a hero, and I think should be seen as a hero, but not for the reasons that all those other authors said, they were all behind the poison thesis. So finding the inconsistencies and doing our best to explain them in the world that we live in today sometimes requires us to go back and challenge the books that we read in high school or in college.
Right. What else do you have to say about this book or anything else that we haven't covered?
I don't really have much to say, except I hope people will read it. If you're not sure if it's for you, the Amazon has a nice little, if you go on your laptop anyway, you can sort of read the introduction. You can get a sense of it. Yes. Because I do think it's something that people will enjoy. Is maybe the wrong word, because it's a lot of sad things that happen in it. But fundamentally, it's an uplifting story of how ordinary men and women sort of triumph over the odds. And if they didn't triumph, their children and the generations that came after them triumphed. So I think it's a good place for anybody who's interested in the larger history beyond the United States of the institution of slavery that we're still wrestling with today in our country. And
where do you see your work going from here?
Well, this was a hard book to write. So I had a lot of great help from the UTA, the History Department, College of Liberal Arts, the Carnegie Foundation, the National Center for the Humanities. They helped me really get about 3 years.
Wow.
Where I didn't have to teach and I could just focus on writing this. And flipping that story is really hard for a PhD type person to do.
I'm sure.
So I don't think I'm going to write another book like this because I don't think I've got the patience for it. Instead, I'm going to keep looking for those little things that don't make sense.
Yes.
And I'm going to start pull some threads and see if we can maybe undo a few more mysteries.
Very good. I don't want to neglect this one point, and that is this is an award-winning book now. Is that
well,
correct?
It's only been out for a couple of months, but the Times Literary Supplement, which is a sort of a well-known British publication, has named it to its list of one of the best books of 2023. So I'm really pleased by that because as academic authors, we don't make much money on our books.
Right.
What we really are interested in doing is getting people interested in our subject, the thing that excites us. And that's the real payoff for me.
Right. Very good. Okay, well, thank you for agreeing to do this. I appreciate it very much. And I appreciate your time and your patience in doing this interview. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Joe. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you.